Hi everyone, I'm Laura Lonsdale and I'm going to be seeing you next week for a class on La Casa de Bernarda Alba. So this is just a short lecture that I'm going to be giving you first of all to give you a few things to think about. I hope you can see me and the PowerPoint. If not, hopefully you can at least hear me and see the PowerPoint. So I guess you're all studying this text for A-level and you probably already know it quite well. So what I'm going to try and do in this lecture is to sort of help you to sort of think about what sort of play it is, what it's trying to do, what its kind of dramatic language is, if you like. I'll start by just saying a little bit about Lorca himself. Again, you may have talked about this in school already, but it's quite helpful, I think, to have a bit of a sense of who Lorca was and what he was aiming to do as a playwright. So he was born in 1898 and then he died in 1936, so he was only young. It was just a year after writing La Casa de Bernarda Alba, and of course it was right at the beginning, at the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War. So he was taken out and shot by nationalist troops in Granada, which was his hometown. He was a very charismatic gay playwright and poet, famous in his lifetime for his moving recitals of his own work. He was a very talented musician. He was an artist. You can see the illustration here is one of his. And of course director, theatre director as well as playwright, who became an emblematic figure really of the defeated Republic, to the extent that he's become almost sort of mythical really. His legacy has reached sort of almost mythical proportions. As a dramatist, he's often remembered for his very sensitive portrayals of women, especially in the trilogy that brought him mainstream acclaim in the 1930s, and which culminated, of course, with La Casa de Bernarda Alba. Like his book of poems, The Romancero Gitano, which he published in 1928, these plays encapsulate a very characteristic combination in Lorca's work of Andalusian folk culture and literary tradition within a very modern kind of artistic mode. So there has been some argument about whether the three plays of what we now accept as the trilogy, so Bodas de Sangre, Yerma and La Casa de Bernarda Alba, really do constitute a trilogy, but they're all set in Andalusia and they're all concerned with themes of repressed and frustrated love. But the fact that they're not always considered a trilogy is one of the things that will sort of inform what I'm going to be talking about now. So as I mentioned, La Casa de Bernarda Alba was the last play that Lorca wrote, and although it shares a number of themes with Bodas de Sangre in particular, it's in many ways really quite different, not only from the other plays of the trilogy, but also from the rest of his dramatic output. So it's much less lyrical than the other plays in the trilogy, and it's also defined as a drama, rather than as a tragedy. So Bodas is described as a tragedia, whereas and Yerma as a poema trágico, but La Casa de Bernarda Alba is a drama de mujeres. And the fact that it's a drama rather than a tragedy means that it doesn't introduce anything strange or impossible into the dramatic action, so like the supernatural figures in Bodas de Sangre, for example. It doesn't incorporate ritual or myth into the dramatic action either, and it doesn't make the characters speak in verse. So broadly speaking, La Casa de Bernarda Alba is a more realist play than the other plays in the trilogy, and that means that it aims, or we would expect that to mean that it aims to be more true to life, that it aims to reflect a sort of a recognisable reality that we can all sort of believe in, if you like. And that's quite significant really, because Lorca was generally not that interested, frankly, in writing realist plays, especially ones that would reflect the audience back to itself, sort of reflect back to the audience things that they already knew and that they were already familiar with. Instead, he wanted to shake up his audience by showing them things that were unfamiliar, that were maybe even uncomfortable. In fact, the play he considered his most important work, El Público, is completely anti-realist, and I'll say more about that in a moment. In La Casa de Bernarda Alba, though, Lorca seems to settle for a more conventional type of theatre, a realist drama, ni una gota de poesía, he said, without even a drop of poetry, resembling a documental fotográfico, so a kind of photographic documentary or sort of record. So why did he do that then, if he had placed so much emphasis in his career on writing sort of anti-realist or certainly not realist plays? Why, right at the end of his career, do we find him writing something which is at least seemingly much more realist? Well, the choice can partly be explained by the fact that art and literature had become much more politicised on the eve of the Spanish Civil War, in those very turbulent years of the Republic before the Civil War, where politics became extremely polarised and society became extremely polarised. And it was becoming much more difficult to justify artistry for its own sake. So a realist play on the theme of oppressive power was going to play well to the mood of this period. But while La Casa de Bernarda Alba may have political themes, it's not really a political play, at least if we compare it to some of the overtly ideological or even propagandistic plays that were being written and performed at the same time. And while the lack of poetry and the likeness to a photographic record suggest that his main aim is to reflect contemporary reality faithfully, the play clearly is poetic in spite of not being written in verse. And the reality he depicts clearly is stylised in spite of having some photographic qualities. So I'm going to look at the way then that language and visual effects are used in the play to create a stylised reality. So as I mentioned, though the plays of the trilogy were his most successful mainstream offerings, it was the plays belonging to what he termed his impossible theatre that he considered the truest expression of what he wanted to say and achieve in the theatre. So El Público, which I mentioned before, which by the way can be translated either as the public or the audience, and that's in itself quite significant, but I won't get into that here. But El Público was described by Lorca as a work in 6 acts and an assassination. And it was probably written in 1930 after a trip to New York and Cuba that also produced his most experimental book of poetry, Poeta en Nueva York. So it was written around that time, 1929-30, but it wasn't actually performed until 1978. And he himself said at the time that it was basically irrepresentable, it was unperformable, it was too experimental, too daring for the theatre of the time. It's as close as his work comes to surrealism, and with its very odd sonography, so things like a large hand imprinted on the wall, a gelatinous moon and X-rays in place of windows, its multiply transforming characters, including 4 white horses, a pair of actorless costumes, and a sinister male nurse ministering to a Christ-like red nude. Its constant breaking of the fourth wall, its confusing dialogues, its erotic imagery verging on the sadomasochistic. It's not an easy play to get to grips with. But importantly, in this play he distinguished between what he called the teatro al aire libre, theatre in the open air, and the teatro bajo la arena, or theatre beneath the sand. And he equated the first, the teatro al aire libre, with superficiality and convention, and the second, teatro bajo la arena, with truth and authenticity. In El Público, truth and authenticity have nothing to do with theatrical realism. In other words, with the attempt to be kind of true to life on stage. Instead, truth and authenticity have to do with stripping away the masks of social, sexual and theatrical convention to get to the truths that we generally choose not to acknowledge or which society chooses to repress. So, if Lorca associated truth in the theatre not with realism but with experimentalism, this brings us back to the question of what he's doing in La Casa de Bernarda Alba. At the first public reading of the play, it was reported that each time the actors finished reading a scene, Lorca would declare enthusiastically, "Ni una gota de poesía, realidad, realismo." So some doubt has been cast on whether or not he actually said these words, but whether he did or not, it's interesting to consider what kind of realidad and realismo we're dealing with in this play. So as I've mentioned, Lorca described the look and feel of the play in terms of photography, framing it as a documental fotográfico. This seems to imply that he wanted to record real contemporary lives accurately and authentically, in keeping with the realist aesthetic that he seems to have espoused at this late stage of his career. However, it's worth remembering that the black and white photographs of his day are in themselves a kind of frame through which to view reality rather than a perfect record of reality itself. After all, we see in colour, don't we? So a black and white photo creates a kind of distance between us and the image, which is why when they kind of colour those old black and white films, the people in them can suddenly seem much more real. So the black and white photo is a kind of frame, and in fact Lorca loved to apply different frames to his works, recreating different visual effects in the staging of his plays. So Mariana Pineda, which is set in the 1830s, is written in scenes which he calls estampas, or engravings, which was a form of illustration that preceded photography. Don Perlimplín is based on an 18th century Alleluia, or kind of comic strip, in a play full of very caricaturish figures. And La Zapatera Prodigiosa is modelled on the travelling puppet theatre. So when Lorca talks about recreating a photographic quality in Bernarda Alba, he's not just talking about realism. In other words, he's not just talking about wanting it to be like reality, but he's transferring the particular visual qualities of black and white photography to the stage. And interestingly, productions of the play have consistently chosen to stick to this restricted colour palette, in spite of massive differences otherwise in their interpretation of the play. So we can see a few examples of this here. This, by the way, is Margarita Xirgu, who was a long-time sort of companion of Lorca. She was an actress and producer who was the first to stage La Casa de Bernarda Alba after Lorca's death in Buenos Aires. So there she is as Bernarda Alba herself. But look at all these different productions. So this was her premiere of the production in Buenos Aires in 1945. And there you have a black and white photo of the black and white sort of colour scheme of the production itself. Here's one from 1950, same again. This is from 1964. Here's a more recent production. This is 1998, so this is obviously a colour photograph, but you can see again the use of black and white on the stage. This is one from 1998. Even more recent, so 2013. This is actually a ballet version of the play, but again you've got that black and white, well, especially black in this particular case, but you've got the light, I suppose, creating contrast there. This is another ballet version of it from 1978 in Stockholm. Again, you can see that black and white contrast. This is a production from 1997 where all the parts were taken by men. So again, another sort of major difference in interpretation, and yet the colour scheme remains. There's Antonio Canales as Bernarda Alba. This one's a little bit different because we've got some red here. We've got the red of the light, but you can see that this time it's this kind of flamenco version of it. And it's a musical as well, and yet still we've got that emphasis on black and white. We'll come on to this in a moment, but here we've got the film director Mario Camus actually bringing out not only the black and white, but that splash of green colour, which of course is so important. So we'll say more about that in a moment. So interesting, isn't it, to see how widely and how variously performed it's been, and yet how that colour scheme has been central to all these very different interpretations of the play. So I was talking about the way that he applies these different frames to his plays and recreates these different kind of visual effects. And in each of the plays that I mentioned, so Mariana Pineda, Don Perlin Plin, which is a shortened version of the full title, which is Amor de Don Perlin Plin con Belisa en su jardín. So in Mariana Pineda, in Don Perlin Plin, in La Zapatera Prodigiosa, there's a connection between the visual effect Lorca wants to create and both the era in which the play is set and the themes that he wants to explore. And this is also true of La Casa de Bernarda Alba, with the black and white scheme evoking not only the early, well, sort of late 19th century, early 20th century, when photography was first being sort of widely used, but also the austere severity of Bernarda's moral regime. And there is, of course, as well, a connection with place. The black and white photograph allowing Lorca to depict Andalusia in its most restricted colour palette, the white of its whitewashed houses and the black of the women's traditional clothes. These are realistic features of Andalusia in the 1930s, which he then exploits to maximum visual effect. Against this restricted palette, chosen by Lorca for its dramatic impact and thematic power, colour can then become not only very visually effective on stage, but also highly symbolic, as in the case of the colourful fan or Adela's green dress, which we can see here in this poster. Of course, a totally realistic portrait of Andalusia would have included colour, but by paring it down to black and white, Lorca can introduce a symbolic contrast between black and white as this kind of scheme to do with moral austerity, and then all the things that are suppressed by it, love, vitality, joy, etc. So the black and white scheme brings together a time, a place, and a mode of artistic representation, as well as imposing a kind of contrastive severity on the mood of the piece. This paring down of the colour scheme can be compared in some ways to the language of the play, which, as I've already pointed out, is much more austere and apparently more prosaic than the language of Bodas de Sangre or Yerma. But once again, this austerity appears to be a kind of stylisation, rather than just an attempt at reproducing ordinary speech. So how is language stylised in Bernarda Alba then? Well, the play is full of invented curses and insults. So, for example, Bernarda calls Angustias yello, and this is apparently a word from the Lorca family's own private vocabulary to mean mujer muy pintada, especialmente de blanco. Maybe it came from the word huevo, egg, so that's sort of, the whiteness of the face. We don't know. Bernarda says to Martirio, mala puñalada te den, mosca muerta, sembradura de vidrios. And this is translated by Gwyn Edwards as, damn you, you sly creature, nothing but a troublemaker. But he's really had to paraphrase here, because if you were to translate this literally, it would be something like, may they stab you, may they give you a really bad stabbing. Mosca muerta literally means dead fly, but it's a way of saying, like butter wouldn't melt or something like that. Sembradura de vidrios is to do with sowing glass into the soil, which would make it infertile. So it implies that she's really kind of poisonous in some way. But you can see how this is really difficult for a translator, because it's very, very figurative language. But it's also figurative in the sense that it's not ordinary speech. It's kind of Lorca's own figures of speech, if you like. Poncia says about Bernarda, mal dolor de clavo le pinche en los ojos, which again Edwards translates as, I'd like to stick a red-hot nail in her eyes, which is pretty accurate, but the phrasing is different. He's had to introduce her own kind of agency, I'd like to, whereas Poncia's version is more like a curse. It's as if she's kind of summoning the pain of the clavo. It's going to pinchar her in the eyes. So it's a different formulation. The English version, as I say, is a bit more kind of personalised. It's got less of that kind of cursing power in some ways of Poncia's formulation. And she also uses this expression sarmentosa por calentura de varón, like a twisted vine reaching out for the heat of a man, which again, is accurate from Edwards, but it's a kind of paraphrase, because the Spanish phrasing is much more compressed and unusual and kind of unfamiliar. Another thing that he does, that Lorca does in the play, is to sort of invent a litany. So a litany is basically a kind of series of calls and responses which you get in the church. There are a series of sort of formulaic prayers, really. And this is what's called the plegaria general, the sort of general prayer in the Catholic Church. So the priest would say, "O Dios Padre, creador del cielo y de la tierra," and the congregation would reply, "Ten misericordia de nosotros," have mercy on us. And then the priest would say again, "O Dios Hijo, redentor del mundo," and the congregation would reply, "Ten misericordia de nosotros." "O Dios Espíritu Santo, santificador de los fieles, ten misericordia de nosotros." "O Santa, bendita y gloriosa Trinidad, un solo Dios, ten misericordia de nosotros," and so on. So that's, there are a number of these litanies, but they're kind of well established in the church, if you like. But what Lorca does is that he creates his own. So let's see if we can see this being performed.
Descansa en paz con la Santa Compañía de cabecera. Descansa en paz. Con el ángel San Miguel y su espada justiciera. Descansa en paz. Con la llave que todo lo abre y la mano que todo lo cierra. Descansa en paz. Con los bienaventurados y las lucecitas del campo. Descansa en paz. Con nuestra santa caridad y las almas de tierra y mar. Descansa en paz.
Okay. So what's interesting about this is the way that he uses the shape of the litany. So he uses this very formulaic structure and phrasing. So you have the call and response. You have these phrases like "sea por siempre bendito y alabado," "descansa en paz." These are sort of plausible sort of structures and phrases for the context of the litany. But he combines that with slightly extravagant or whimsical imagery. So we've got San Miguel, who, by the way, is the patron saint of Granada. We've got him kind of brandishing his sword. We've got a mention of the Santa Compañía, which is a procession of the dead, and it's a strange reference, really, because it's a kind of mythical belief from the northwest of Spain, from Galicia, but it's sort of slightly superstitious, so it's kind of surprising and a bit sort of whimsical, as I say. And then we've got these gentle lucecitas del campo, which seem a bit incongruous. They sort of contrast in a way with the very kind of heavy, abstracted, formulaic language, religious language and imagery of the litany. So all of this makes it feel as much like a folk ballad as like an act of collective worship. And in fact, both in the use of rhyme and metre, this Lorcian litany also in some ways evokes the folk ballad. So folk ballads would have been spoken, they would have been spoken aloud in company. So he's bringing together in some ways this kind of collective act of worship with a very different form of collective speech, if you like. So he manages to convey the formal ritual atmosphere of the litany, whilst at the same time introducing a local, rural, popular dimension to the words that are being spoken. So there's a real sense of place in that. And then, in addition to that, we have this phrase, "la llave que todo lo abre y la mano que todo lo cierra," which is an evocation of total power, isn't it? And of course, this is to do with the power of God, but in this context, in a play about tyranny and about oppressive power, it also evokes that, doesn't it? So, in other words, Lorca doesn't just cut and paste the litany into his play, which would be entirely authentic, if you like, totally realistic, wouldn't it? This is what the women would be saying at a funeral mass or at a wake. But instead he creates one. He invents one that conveys and extends the mood, setting and themes of his play. Another small clue to Lorca's stylising of reality through language can be found in his very hyperbolic use of numbers. So we're told that there are 200 women at the funeral. We're told that they're going to have 8 years of mourning. And this suggests a poetic interpretation of reality rather than a totally realistic interpretation of it. And it also draws again on folk tradition, where typically numbers would be very large, often exaggerated, and usually very round as well, like 200 women. And finally, there's often an underlying violence to the language that's used, so that Adela, for example, sees estrellas como puños, stars like fists, or describes looking at Pepe as being like slowly drinking his blood. And this underlying violence not only reinforces the atmosphere of cruelty and harm, but emphasises the contained but powerful feeling that runs like an electric charge through the silence that surrounds them in the prison of Bernarda's house. And note that the title of the play, La Casa de Bernarda Alba, puts very powerful emphasis not only on the physical space in which they are imprisoned, but evokes something tragic, dynastic even, like Greek tragedy's House of Atreus, for example. The ordinary prosaic word casa is full of symbolic resonance, and so is much of the language employed in the play. So, to conclude then, La Casa de Bernarda Alba is unusual in Lorca's dramatic work because it operates in a much more realist, less lyrical and less experimental mode than many of his other plays. But Lorca knew that even realist plays are not themselves real, and that reality must be stylised and transported to a more universal dimension if it's going to have any meaning. So he chose a frame, the documental fotografico, that not only suggested a concern with being true to life, but which was itself a lens through which to view the reality he was interested in representing. He took the black and white austerity of the photograph and brought it together with certain characteristics of time and place to generate a visual representation of severity, austerity, sameness and extremity. The themes of the play are, in a sense, interpreted visually, and against this backdrop, colour can operate symbolically. At the same time, though the language is not versified, it remains highly poetic, highly figurative, pushing at the limits of what a contemporary audience might have recognised as familiar or ordinary speech. And so what we end up with is a highly stylised form of realism, with artistry still very much at the heart of Lorca's visual, dramatic and symbolic engagement with social reality. So I'll look forward to seeing you next week, and we'll be looking at a passage of text together and thinking about some of the other dimensions of the play. I hope you'll all be sort of up for a good discussion, and I look forward to seeing you then. Okay, bye.